In the glittering heart of Philadelphia's Gilded Age, a young woman stands at the edge of her destiny. Promised to a powerful banker, Penelope Van Allen is bound by duty, yet her heart whispers of freedom. Beneath chandeliers and silken gowns lies a silent war between obedience and desire, between the price of silence and the cost of truth. What begins as a bargain in society's eyes becomes a storm of passion and defiance, when a single journey changes everything. Tell me, dear listener, where in the world are you joining us from? And what do you love most about these timeless period romances, where love dares to defy the rules of its age? Philadelphia, winter of 1878. The air inside the Van Allen mansion was cold, despite the fire that crackled dutifully in the marble hearth. The once grand house, nestled near Rittenhouse Square, still carried the ghost of elegance: heavy brocade curtains, tarnished silver candle holders, and portraits of ancestors whose gazes seemed to judge the present with silent disdain. Penelope Van Allen sat upright on the tufted settee in the drawing room, her gloved hands resting in her lap, pale fingers knotted together like porcelain vines. She wore a winter day dress in slate blue silk, trimmed in black velvet, with a modest bustle and high lace collar that scratched slightly at her throat. Her dark chestnut hair was pulled back into a tight chignon, a few rebellious curls escaping near her temples. Across from her, her mother, Dorothea Van Allen, adjusted a pearl earring and said without looking up, "You mustn't slouch, Penelope. Posture reveals character." Her father stood by the window, staring into the grey afternoon. His frock coat hung heavily on his shoulders. Though he said nothing, the nervous clenching of his jaw betrayed more than mere concern over the weather. "We are fortunate," Dorothea continued, folding a letter and placing it atop the silver tray on the table. "Horace Whitfield is a man of vision, ambition, security. You will have a fine home, a place in society." "A price," Penelope murmured under her breath. Dorothea's gaze snapped toward her. "What did you say?" "Nothing," Penelope replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. They spoke of the engagement as though it were a business merger, because it was. The Van Allen name still carried weight in Philadelphia, but the fortune behind it had long since eroded. Horace Whitfield, with his sprawling banking empire and hunger for social ascendancy, needed the old blood just as much as her parents needed his wealth. That evening, Penelope dressed for the dinner at the Union League Club. May, her maid, helped her into a gown of cream silk with sapphire trim, imported from Paris 2 seasons prior, still elegant enough to silence whispers of decline. Penelope stood before the mirror as May fastened the jet buttons down the back, her gaze fixed on her own reflection. Her face was calm, as it had always been taught to be. Her grey-blue eyes betrayed nothing, though inside a quiet panic pressed against her ribs. At the club, chandeliers bathed the hall in golden light. Gentlemen in black tailcoats and women in gleaming satins murmured behind fans. Penelope entered on her father's arm, poised, unreadable. Horace Whitfield greeted her with a possessive smile. He was a man of 52, thick around the waist, with thinning blonde hair and a moustache that had been waxed into submission. He bent to kiss her gloved hand, his lips dry, his fingers too warm. When he lifted his glass, his voice rang out with pride. "To the future Mrs. Whitfield," he said, loud enough for all to hear. Applause rose around them like smoke. Penelope offered a faint nod, her throat tight. The evening passed in a blur of clinking silver, forced laughter, and practiced compliments. Horace whispered into her ear tales of the home he was having built outside Chestnut Hill and how her portrait would hang above the fireplace. "Imagine," he said, "your beauty immortalized in oil." Penelope smiled at him as custom required, though her heart recoiled. Later, in the solitude of her bedchamber, Penelope dismissed May and stood again before the mirror. She removed the sapphire earrings, the combs from her hair, the silk gloves that bore the faintest scent of his cologne. One by one, the symbols of her gilded cage fell away. The room was silent, but for the ticking of the mantel clock. Her reflection stared back at her, flawless, composed, utterly unknown. She whispered to the darkness, "I am not hers anymore." But no one heard. The whistle of the morning train pierced the winter silence like a blade through silk. Frost glazed the windows of the Van Allen carriage as it rumbled toward the station, the wheels groaning beneath the weight of polished trunks and unworn expectation. Inside, seated beneath a heavy wool lap blanket, Penelope Van Allen stared out at the grey cityscape, watching smoke rise from chimneys and horses' hooves leave dark prints in the slush-laden streets. Her gloved hands rested on her knees, unmoving. A soft pulse throbbed in her throat, delicate but defiant, as the carriage pulled to a stop beneath the towering iron arches of the Broad Street station. A porter opened the door, and the cold air rushed in like a warning. May, her maid, adjusted the folds of Penelope's travelling cloak, a rich navy velvet lined with silk faille, and handed her the matching hat, trimmed with jet beading and a narrow plume. "You'll wire when you arrive, miss?" May asked softly. Penelope nodded, then paused. From beneath her gloves, she produced a folded envelope sealed with her mother's crest and tucked it into her reticule. It had been slipped to her in silence just that morning. "Do not disappoint us." The words echoed as she ascended the platform, boots clicking softly against the wet wood. The steam from the engine hissed like breath drawn between clenched teeth. She glanced up toward the first-class car, where attendants bustled about with polished shoes and brass-buttoned uniforms. Inside, warmth greeted her like a lie. Mahogany paneling gleamed beneath crystal sconces. Cushioned seats upholstered in plum damask lined either side of the aisle. A firebox at the far end glowed faintly. Penelope moved forward with quiet elegance, drawing curious glances from two older women already seated near the front. Her eyes met the conductor's briefly, and he gestured toward a seat farther down. "Gentlemen's travelling alone, miss. Car's quiet. Should be a peaceful journey." She nodded, then made her way to the indicated seat, plush, wide, opposite another. As she settled in, she allowed herself a single breath of solitude, but then she lifted her gaze. Across from her, seated with one leg crossed over the other, sat a man in a dark frock coat and simple wool trousers. He was not young nor old, somewhere perhaps in the unspoken realm between 30 and 40. His build was lean but sturdy, his posture at ease, yet not indifferent. A felt hat rested on the seat beside him. In his hands, folded on his lap, he held a leather-bound book. His eyes were already on her. They were hazel, flecked with gold. Not probing, not brash, just quietly observant. Penelope's breath caught. She lowered her gaze. He inclined his head politely. "Good morning," he said. His voice was low, smooth, tinged with something unplaceable, something weathered. "Good morning," she replied, her own voice firmer than she expected. He said nothing more. She was grateful for it, grateful and vaguely disappointed. The train lurched forward. With a gentle sigh, the city began to fall away behind them, replaced by frozen fields and bare trees, their branches etched like ink against the pewter sky. Penelope unfastened her cloak and laid it beside her. The warmth of the car had reached her hands, but not her chest. Moments passed. Minutes. A quiet tension bloomed between them, not uncomfortable, but aware. He turned a page in his book. The movement drew her eye. She noticed then. His hands bore faint scars across the knuckles. Not angry or fresh, but healed reminders of something that had not always been gentle. She spoke before she could stop herself. "What are you reading?" He glanced up again. "Walt Whitman," he said. "His memoranda during the war." Penelope hesitated. "Are you a soldier then?" "Was," he answered. "A long time ago." There was no pride in his tone, no dramatics, just truth. "I see," she murmured. A beat. Then he added, "Nathaniel Prescott." She blinked, startled by the introduction. Her hand rose slowly. "Penelope Van Allen." His brow lifted slightly. "Of the Van Allens of Chestnut Hill. My parents live near Rittenhouse Square now," she replied. Her tone was neutral, neither confirming nor denying. He nodded as though understanding something unspoken. Their conversation drifted into stillness again, but the air between them had shifted. No longer strangers in the formal sense, they sat like two travelers orbiting a fragile, invisible thread. They spoke again once the train passed Wilmington. He asked if she was traveling far. She explained she was on her way to Washington to visit her aunt. She did not mention the wedding preparations, and he, in return, said he had business in Alexandria, something to do with a hospital for veterans. He kept his voice modest, his sentences spare, but something about his way of speaking, measured, never hurried, made her feel as though he chose each word with intention. When she asked gently about the book, he read her a single line, not performed, just shared. The real war will never get in the books. She let that sit in the space between them. The snow began to fall sometime after noon. At first, just a dusting. Then heavier, more insistent, the conductor passed through, muttering about conditions ahead. By the time the train slowed, they were passing through rural Maryland, and then, with a jolt and a shudder, the engine came to a halt. Penelope glanced toward the window. Snow lashed sideways against the glass. The sky had turned white. Passengers murmured. Attendants rushed forward. A brakeman entered the car. "Storms rolled in faster than expected," he announced. "We'll be stopping at a small station just ahead until visibility improves. Might be a few hours, might be overnight." A ripple of discontent moved through the car. Nathaniel looked at Penelope. "Well," he said quietly, "seems we're being asked to practice patience." She allowed herself a smile, an admirable quality. Not long after, they arrived at the station, a modest structure of wood and stone with a pot-bellied stove in the corner and benches worn smooth by time. The snow roared outside, turning the platform into a blur. Passengers huddled around the stove. Blankets were handed out. A few children dozed. Penelope found herself seated beside Nathaniel once again, this time not across a velvet aisle, but on a hard bench with only inches between them. The closeness was not improper, and yet it trembled with meaning. They spoke quietly, of nothing and everything. He told her about his time after the war, the widow he had married, the fever that took her 3 winters later. Penelope listened with an ache in her throat. When he finished, she said nothing, only reached out, hesitated, then let her gloved hand brush lightly, accidentally against his. He didn't flinch. Outside, the snow fell like silence itself, and inside, beside a stranger whose voice now lived somewhere deep in her ribs, Penelope felt something strange and terrifying begin to unfold, something she did not yet name, but could not deny. She would later remember the lantern light dancing on the floorboards, the scent of cedar smoke, the quiet weight of his presence beside her, and the moment she realized that obedience, once so certain, had begun to unravel. The storm held the countryside in a breathless hush. Outside the station, snow fell in heavy, slanting curtains, devouring the tracks beneath its white weight. The wind moaned low through the wooden rafters, its voice old and relentless. Within the walls of the rural depot, light came not from chandeliers or gas lamps, but from kerosene lanterns and the dim, flickering glow of a pot-bellied stove that struggled against the cold. The stranded passengers huddled together like forgotten relics of another world, wrapped in shawls, traveling cloaks and silence. The station was modest, a single-room structure with timbered walls darkened by soot and time. Benches lined the perimeter, and a clerk had long since abandoned his post behind the counter, choosing instead to fetch blankets from the baggage room. Penelope sat near the stove, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands folded in her lap. Her traveling dress, though elegant in its tailoring, offered little protection from the creeping chill that seeped into the floorboards. A strand of her chestnut hair had escaped the chignon and clung damply to her cheek. She made no effort to tuck it away. Nathaniel Prescott was seated beside her, just close enough that their elbows might graze if either moved too abruptly, but not close enough to suggest impropriety. He had removed his overcoat and offered it to a young mother traveling with an infant, leaving himself in only his dark wool vest and shirt sleeves. His breath still steamed faintly in the frigid air. They had not spoken in several minutes, yet the silence between them felt alive, delicate, suspended. The clamour of the day had receded into a kind of quiet intimacy that neither had chosen, but both now accepted. A lantern hung from a hook above them, casting golden light across the rugged plains of Nathaniel's face. Penelope watched the play of shadow along his jawline, the way his lashes caught the light when he blinked. She studied him, as if trying to memorize something she didn't yet understand. "You seem peaceful," she said softly. He turned to her, one brow lifting. "That's a dangerous observation, Miss Van Allen. Peace is often mistaken for surrender. I didn't mean it as an insult." His lips curved faintly. "No offense taken." She glanced away, her gaze drifting to the window. All she could see was snow and darkness. Somewhere, far beyond the storm, her future waited like a cold ring upon her finger. "I envy it," she murmured. Nathaniel's voice was low. "Envy what?" "Peace, the kind that comes from not pretending." He said nothing for a moment, but she felt the weight of his attention, steady and unmoving. "You're not used to stillness, are you?" he asked. "No," she confessed. "In my world, silence is not quiet. It's judgment waiting to be spoken." He considered that. "And in mine, silence was what followed cannon fire. It was the only thing louder." She looked at him then, fully. "You fought in the war," he nodded. "Union Army, infantry, then officer, 2nd Corps, Gettysburg, Petersburg. I saw the worst of men and the best of them, often in the same breath." She pressed her hands together more tightly. "You survived." "I did," he said simply. "Not everyone did, not even the ones who came home." The words hung in the air like frost. She watched him carefully, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you lose someone?" He didn't answer immediately. He rubbed his hands together, those scarred, capable hands, and stared into the firebox as if sifting through years. "My wife," he said at last. "We married after the war. Her name was Louisa. She died 3 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry," she said with a quiet sincerity that surprised her. He looked at her then, his eyes clear but softened by memory. "So am I." She was kind, steady. She saw something in me I hadn't learned to see myself, and she made it real. The tenderness in his tone ached somewhere beneath her ribs. It wasn't the grief of a man broken by loss. It was the reverence of a man who had known real love. Penelope lowered her gaze. "I've never known someone to speak of a wife that way." "Then you've never met a man who earned her," he replied gently. Her throat tightened. She felt a sudden, sharp sadness that had no name. It wasn't about Nathaniel's story, or Louisa. It was about what she had never tasted, never touched, what she was expected to live without. "My parents have arranged a match for me," she said, before she could stop herself. He said nothing, waiting. "His name is Horace Whitfield," she continued. "He's 52, a banker, very respectable." Nathaniel's jaw moved slightly, but he remained quiet. "It's not a love match," she added, her voice thin. "It's a transaction. My family lost more than they let on, and he wants a wife with a name older than his." He tilted his head. "And you?" "I don't have the luxury of wanting," she said. "Not really." His gaze stayed on her, unreadable. Then he spoke, slow and quiet. "Everyone wants, whether they're allowed to or not." She met his eyes then, and for a moment the space between them seemed to contract, reduced to breath, to heat, to something unspeakably intimate. The lantern above them flickered. Around them, others murmured drowsily, shared tea, rearranged their makeshift beds. A few children snored under thick wool coats. The storm had softened outside, but the wind still howled like a lonely animal beyond the walls. Nathaniel shifted slightly, reaching into the pocket of his vest. He withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook and a stub of pencil. "I write sometimes," he said. "Helps me hold on to things I'm afraid to forget." He didn't offer to show her, and she didn't ask. Instead, she whispered, "Do you think it's possible to want something so badly that you begin to believe you've already lost it?" He closed the notebook without writing a word. "Yes," he said, "and sometimes that belief keeps us from ever having it at all." She turned her face toward the stove, letting the heat kiss her cheek. She was not cold, not anymore. The clerk returned with a few more blankets. A pair of lanterns were extinguished to preserve oil. The station dimmed. Penelope laid her head gently against the wooden wall behind her, eyes drifting shut. But not before she stole one last glance at the man beside her, whose name she had only learned hours ago, and whose presence now filled the very air around her like breath. Nathaniel did not sleep. He sat in silence, watching the snow slide down the windows, the soft rise and fall of Penelope's breath. Outside, the night gave way slowly to the pale suggestion of dawn. And when the conductor's call came at last, when the engine groaned to life and passengers were roused from their cocoon of frost and firelight, Penelope rose with grace and gathered her things. At the edge of the platform, she turned back. Nathaniel stood beneath the awning, his hat in hand, snow caught on his shoulders like ash. He tipped his head to her, not a bow, but a quiet farewell. She offered no words, only a look. It was brief. But in that moment, everything unspoken between them lingered, like smoke, like snow, like something unfinished. Then the train pulled away. The gaslights burned with cold precision along the grand hall of the Franklin Institute, casting a pale gold sheen over velvet gowns and polished shoes. Music swelled from a string quartet tucked beneath a painted arch, its melody graceful but hollow, echoing against marble columns and gilded cornices. The scent of beeswax and perfume lingered in the air, too sweet, too deliberate, like powdered sugar covering something half-rotten beneath. Penelope stood at the edge of the ballroom, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the stem of a crystal goblet. Her gown was new, Whitfield had insisted, ivory silk, hand-embroidered with silver thread, the bodice cut just modestly enough to satisfy society's rules and just boldly enough to satisfy his taste. A pair of pearl earrings hung from her ears, heavy despite their size, and her mother's sapphire brooch glittered on her décolletage like a mark of possession. Beside her, Horace Whitfield spoke to a trio of men in dark coats, their laughter low and indulgent. He had not introduced her. He rarely did when discussing matters of business or legacy. Instead, he kept one gloved hand resting possessively at the small of her back, guiding her gently but firmly toward or away from whoever he deemed worthy or dangerous. Her gaze swept across the hall, past women in crimson velvets and frosted blue satins, their smiles fixed, their eyes sharp. Penelope's breath was steady, her posture flawless. No one would have guessed that she felt like glass, stretched and brittle, a single touch away from shattering. "Smile," Horace whispered at her ear, not unkindly, but with the weight of expectation. She obeyed, turning her face toward him with the same grace she had been trained to wear since childhood. But her mind had drifted far from the polished floor and chandeliers. It lingered in the hush of a snowbound station, in the warmth of a pot-bellied stove, in the hush of a voice that had spoken of grief without bitterness, and love without pride. Nathaniel. She should have forgotten him by now. She had tried, but his presence had not receded with the snow. It clung to her skin like cold air after twilight, quiet but insistent. She hadn't even known his name when she had first looked into his eyes, but now it echoed in her mind when she dressed in silence, when she walked through drawing rooms filled with hollow laughter and veiled ambition. Nathaniel Prescott, the man who spoke like truth and carried pain in his hands without letting it turn to bitterness. Whitfield's hand slid up slightly, guiding her toward a pair of matrons near the refreshment table. His grip tightened for a brief moment as they passed a group of young men she had once danced with in her first season, before her family's decline had begun to show. "Heirs without titles," he muttered, "charming but useless." Penelope said nothing. She did not need to be reminded of what this alliance meant, what it had been constructed to protect. Later in the evening, as the room bloomed with candlelight and the music shifted into a waltz, Whitfield drew her close for a dance. He was not a clumsy partner. He knew the steps, moved with practiced confidence. But there was no softness in the way he held her, no listening in the way he moved in time to the music. His fingers pressed firmly against her spine, guiding, claiming. "You've been distant," he said, voice low, measured. "I've been tired," she answered, her tone even. "Your mother tells me you've been receiving calls from your old acquaintances, that you've turned away several invitations. That isn't wise, darling. Appearances matter, especially now." She met his gaze without blinking. "I've simply been reflecting." He smiled tightly. "You'll have all the time in the world to reflect once the wedding's over." When the music ended, he led her off the floor and excused himself to speak with a foreign investor, leaving her momentarily alone near a column wrapped in winter roses. Her eyes wandered, not in search of someone, but in need of stillness. That was when she heard it. His voice, unmistakably his, low and careless. "She's a good girl, and her father's desperation has made her obedient." A pause. Laughter. "You know the Van Allens were clinging to dust and memory. I bought both for a very reasonable price." Her stomach turned. The voice was Whitfield's. The men he spoke with chuckled, murmuring something about pedigree and profit. Penelope didn't move. She couldn't, not immediately. Something in her chest recoiled, curled in on itself like silk burning at the edge of a flame. She turned her face away from the sound, toward the cold glass of a window. She focused on her breath, long and measured, the way one might in a drowning. When she returned to his side, he smiled at her, offered her his arm again. She took it. 3 days later, Penelope visited St. Bridget's Infirmary for veterans under the pretense of delivering blankets for the wounded. The staff knew her family name and welcomed her with polite curiosity. The hallways were narrow, lined with old oak paneling and filled with the scent of disinfectant and boiled linen. The patients, men marked by war, some whole in body, others not, sat in quiet clusters, playing chess, reading, staring out at the courtyard with eyes that held too many winters. Penelope moved among them slowly, speaking little, carrying herself with respectful grace. She did not ask who was missing limbs or who had once commanded regiments. She simply offered warmth, gloves, scarves, books. Her breath caught when she entered the western wing. He was there. Nathaniel stood beside a narrow bed, speaking softly to a grey-bearded man with a sunken chest. He held a tin cup in one hand and a folded blanket in the other. He looked up as she entered, not surprised, but still. Their eyes met across the quiet space, and for a moment everything in the room disappeared. The chill of the ballroom, the press of Whitfield's hand, the judgment wrapped in pearls and cravats. It all fell away. Only this remained. He approached her with a polite nod, the air between them thick with unspoken things. "Miss Van Allen," he greeted. "Mr. Prescott," she replied, voice soft. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "I might say the same," she answered, a faint smile. "I come twice a week, sometimes more." They spoke near a window, voices low as the wind rattled faintly against the panes. I heard things at the ball," she said, not looking at him. He waited. "Things said about my family, about me." Her voice trembled, but she kept it steady. He didn't ask what. Instead he said, "Words have teeth, but they don't define you." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment the pain in her chest cracked open, letting something else in, something unnamed, but not unfamiliar. Before she could answer, the door behind them creaked open. A young nurse entered, followed by a tall man in a grey coat, one of Whitfield's clerks. The man did not speak to her. He simply looked once, then turned and left. The message was clear. She turned back to Nathaniel. "I should go." He didn't stop her. He only nodded once, slowly. But as she walked away, her gloves tight against her hands and her heart hammering against her ribs, she knew, without question, that someone would tell Whitfield. and when they did, nothing would remain quite the same. The ink was still wet on the page when Penelope folded the letter, her breath catching as she pressed the wax seal into place. The crimson emblem bore no crest, no initials, no sign of sender, just a smooth impression formed by the back of a pearl ring. She held it in her palm for a moment longer than necessary, as if the warmth of the paper might reach back to the hands that would receive it. Nathaniel. Since their brief encounter at the infirmary, words had become their only meeting place. Real ones were too dangerous. But written words, letters slipped between folds of books, tucked behind garden gates, or left discreetly at the St. Bridget's receiving desk, became their sanctuary. A quiet rebellion whispered in ink. She did not call him dear, nor did he call her beloved. But there were phrases that trembled with tenderness, metaphors laced with restraint, lines of Whitman or Tennyson that said what they could not. There is something in your silence that speaks more honestly than the hundreds of voices I've known. I do not seek salvation in your presence, only the permission to breathe. The correspondence was neither frequent nor predictable. Days might pass, sometimes more, without a word. Yet each letter came like a balm, softening the edges of her isolation, reminding her that somewhere in this grey, bricked city, a man remembered the sound of her voice. A man who had looked at her and not seen a bargain. And though Penelope never let the letters linger long in her possession, hiding them behind the false back of her escritoire, the risk gnawed at her. It gave her no thrill, only tension, threaded with something far more dangerous than fear. Hope. One late afternoon, while the house was quiet and the fire in the drawing room had grown low, she had been careless. She had left her desk drawer unlocked. She had gone to fetch a shawl from the corridor when footsteps approached. Nora, the girl, barely 16, had been with the household only a short while, meek, watchful, eager to please. She had been dusting along the bookshelf and paused when the loose corner of a folded page slipped free from a drawer left slightly ajar. She had not meant to read it, but the seal was already broken. The words, soft and aching, reached into her, unfamiliar yet somehow beautiful. She knew what she held, and she told. Mrs. Van Allen stood by the window when Penelope entered her mother's chamber that evening, the heavy drapes pulled back to reveal a dusk-smeared sky. She did not turn immediately. Instead, she let the silence stretch, stiff and cold. "Close the door," she said at last. Penelope obeyed. Her mother faced her then, eyes hard and colourless, the opened letter in her hand. "Is this yours?" Penelope's voice was quiet. "Yes, Mrs." Van Allen's nostrils flared, as if her daughter's calmness offended her more than the offence itself. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for our name? For your future?" "It was never about the future," Penelope murmured. "It was only a letter." "There is no such thing," her mother snapped. "Not when it comes from a man who has no place in your world. No title, no name, no money. And not when you are weeks away from becoming the wife of a man who can restore our standing." Oh, Penelope looked down. "He restores nothing. He owns." Mrs. Van Allen stepped forward, her voice lower now, sharper. "Burn them, everyone. I want no trace of this foolishness left in this house. I will not have your name whispered over drawing-room carpets by women with nothing better to do." "I have nothing better to do," Penelope said almost to herself, "except exist beneath a man I do not love, for the sake of debts I did not create." Her mother's hand struck the air, not in a slap, but in a tremble of outrage. "This is not about love. Love is for books, for peasants. You were born to uphold a lineage. You will not trade it for poetry." When Penelope left the room, she held her chin high, but the skin beneath her collarbone ached as though bruised. That night, she burned 3 letters in the hearth. The smoke curled around her like a ghost. But one she could not part with, remained hidden beneath the lining of her glove box, not for reading, only for remembering. She had not heard from Nathaniel in 5 days. She feared what silence might mean, whether it came from caution or regret. She was not wrong to fear. Whitfield's carriage arrived without notice the next morning. He entered the parlour with the false cheer of a man who knew the scent of power. His hat in hand, his boots freshly polished, he greeted Mrs. Van Allen with overplayed warmth and then turned to Penelope with something else in his eyes: control. "I've taken the liberty of arranging a donation in your name," he said, pouring himself a glass of port from the sideboard, "to St. Bridget's. I believe in philanthropy that looks good on paper." Penelope tensed. "That's generous." He sipped. "It's practical." There was a beat of silence. Then he added casually, "You've been seen there. I was surprised." She said nothing. He continued, voice lowering, "And not alone." Now she looked up. His smile remained, but it had sharpened at the edges. "I spoke with Mr. Prescott, under the guise of charity, of course. A noble man by all appearances, and quite intelligent. I told him, politely, that our circle is delicate, that we don't appreciate disturbances." Penelope's stomach twisted. "You threatened him." "I warned him. There's a difference." "What did he say?" Whitfield's smile faded slightly. "He said nothing. But silence, my dear, is never empty. It's full of the things people are too proud to beg for." She turned away, unable to breathe. Whitfield set down his glass. "It's time you remembered what's at stake. Your father's creditors have no patience left. I've held them back, but only so long. Our wedding will not be delayed." She did not answer. That evening, Nathaniel sat alone in his quarters above the infirmary, the fireplace crackling softly, a letter half-written resting on the desk beside him. He stared out the window, past the dark roofs and flickering lamps, toward the parts of the city where light did not reach, where silence spoke not of peace, but of loss. He picked up the letter, then slowly he set it aside. In his chest, something had begun to close, not violently, but with the steady ache of a man who understood that sometimes the most decent thing one can do for a woman already spoken for is to disappear. The morning broke not with brilliance, but with a pale, heavy mist that clung to the window panes like doubt. It muted the light, blurred the shapes of carriages below, and cloaked the world in a silence that felt oddly conspiratorial. Penelope stood at her dressing table, fastening the final hook on a simple grey wool gown. The fabric was unadorned, its sleeves plain, the skirt narrower than society demanded. She left behind the pearl earrings, the corseted silhouettes, the velvet-trimmed cloaks that declared one's status from a distance. Today, she wanted no declarations. May looked at her through the mirror's reflection, uncertain. "Will you be gone long, miss?" "Not long," Penelope said gently, though the truth sat deeper in her chest. "But long enough." She left through the servants' entrance, a modest bonnet tied under her chin and gloves fitted tightly to conceal the trembling in her fingers. She walked instead of calling the carriage, not because the distance to St. Bridget's was great, but because she needed to feel the world beneath her feet, to remember that her life, her body, her choices had weight. The streets were quieter than usual, the fog muffling wheels and footsteps alike. Children darted through alleyways with paper kites trailing behind them, and a flower seller lit a small brazier to warm her fingers between sales. Penelope passed them unseen, her mind fixed on a door she had no permission to open. When she reached the infirmary, she paused before entering. The red brick building loomed tall, its windows smudged by years, and its eaves heavy with weather-worn ivy. It was not a place of beauty, but of honesty, of lives scraped bare of pretense. Inside, the smell of carbolic and tobacco lingered in the air. Voices murmured behind closed doors. The nurse at the front desk recognized her and nodded silently, then gestured toward the west wing. Penelope's steps were slow, her breath careful. Each stride toward Nathaniel's world felt like a defiance stitched into her very being. This was not where women of her name belonged. And yet, This was where her heart had gone. She found him at the end of the corridor, seated beside a cot where a young soldier, no more than 20, was attempting to lace a boot with only one hand. Nathaniel knelt beside him, offering neither pity nor overbearing help, just presence, just patience. Penelope did not speak. He looked up, startled, but only for a moment. Then his expression softened into something unreadable. Perhaps awe, perhaps worry. She stepped forward. "I didn't write. I didn't expect you to." Silence stretched between them, tender and fragile. "I wanted to see," she whispered, her eyes scanning the room, "to see what your world looks like when no one else is watching." Nathaniel stood slowly. His coat was worn at the seams, ink stained one cuff, and yet he carried himself with the kind of grace that had nothing to do with lineage. "You shouldn't be here," he said, not coldly but with a quiet ache. "I know," she replied. He studied her. "It's not safe. Not for you, not now." A breath. Then she said, "Nothing is safe anymore. Not the things they want from me. Not the man I'm meant to marry. Not the life I've been told is mine. I wanted to see something real before I forget what it feels like." He stepped closer, just enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "You think this is real? These walls, this place?" "I think you are," she said. He inhaled sharply. The words pierced something deep in him, something he had worked hard to seal. "I don't have the right to hear that from you," he said. "Not when I cannot give you anything in return. You gave me truth. I gave you longing," he said bitterly. "And now it might cost you everything." She stepped closer. "What if it's a price I'm willing to pay?" "No," he said, too quickly, too firmly. "Don't say that. You don't know what it means. What they'll do. You think this world bends for love, but it doesn't. It breaks people for it." She looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Then let it break me. At least I will know it was for something I chose." His hand reached for hers, hesitated, then stopped. He couldn't. Not here. Not now. But the silence between them pulsed with everything they could not touch. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the sharp edges of the city. Penelope stepped back, her fingers trembling in her gloves. "I should go," she said, though every cell in her body screamed to remain. He nodded, the muscle in his jaw tightening. "Be careful," he said. She turned, walked past the rows of beds and worn floors, past men who no longer watched her with curiosity. Her heart beat loudly in her ears, but it was not fear. It was something more dangerous. Conviction. She exited into the street, where the light had sharpened into a pale winter gold, but she was not alone. Across the road, half shrouded in shadow beneath the awning of a tobacconist, stood a man in a grey overcoat, his hat pulled low, eyes trained not on her face, but on her movement. She walked, steadily, not turning, but every instinct told her. She was being followed. He kept a distance, not enough to alarm, but enough to remind. By the time she reached home, the dread had bloomed into certainty. Her father was waiting in the library, the door already ajar. He did not rise when she entered. He stood by the fire, a brandy in his hand, his posture rigid. "Where have you been?" he asked, though he already knew. She did not lie. "I went for a walk." His laugh was bitter. "You always were poor at fiction." He turned slowly, his face gaunt beneath the chandelier's flickering light. There was no rage in his eyes, only weariness, and a fear too deep for shouting. "You've made yourself noticed," he said. "And in this city, Penelope, that is a kind of death." She stood straight. "If they notice me, then they remember me. I prefer that to disappearing in silk." He slammed the glass down on the sideboard, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to tremble. "You will not destroy what is left of this family's dignity." "Dignity?" she repeated. "What dignity is there in being sold like a parcel?" He stepped forward, his voice lowering into something cold. "If you defy Whitfield, if you shame him, if you humiliate me, you will not find this house open to you. You will not inherit this name. You will not be welcome in this world." She stared at him, her breath shallow, and then, very softly, she said, "Then let me build another." He looked at her as though he did not know her, as though the child he had raised had been replaced with a woman he had never permitted to exist. When she left the room, her hands were trembling, her throat tight with the weight of what she had just dared to say. But beneath it all, in the marrow of her bones, a strange warmth stirred. The first breath of rebellion, not spoken in rage, not lit by fury, but born of love, and the quiet, unyielding belief that her heart still belonged to her. The wind moved softly through the lace curtains of the Van Allen conservatory, carrying the scent of hyacinth and something heavier beneath, something unspoken, unsettled. Afternoon light filtered through the glass panes above, painting golden squares across the marble floor. The room, though intended for peace, trembled with the quiet anticipation of a storm no one could see yet, but that Penelope felt deep within her chest. She stood near the tall orchid stand, gloved hands clasped at her waist, her breath still from the moment May had whispered that Mr. Prescott had arrived and was waiting, not in the drawing room, not under the gaze of family portraits and stiff butlers, but here, among the blooms and warmth. When he stepped through the open French doors, Nathaniel removed his hat in silence. His coat was damp from the chill outside, his boots marked by the walk, not by ceremony. There was nothing remarkable about his presence, no grand gestures, no flourishes of passion. But the moment he looked at her, the air changed. He bowed slightly. "Miss Van Allen, Mr. Prescott." There was a long pause. Neither moved closer. "I had to see you," he said quietly, his voice low and raw. "Perhaps it is foolish, but I couldn't leave without—" "Leave?" she interrupted, a tremor in her voice. "I've made arrangements," he said, "to return to Boston. There's work at the new home for veterans. It's needed, and I no longer believe I'm welcome here." Her hands tightened. "But before I go," he continued, "I had to offer you a choice." She turned to him fully now, her bodice rising with each breath, her eyes impossibly wide. "I came here with nothing," he said, "and I still have nothing to offer you. No ring, no house waiting with servants or titles or silk-lined rooms. Only my name, only truth. If you come with me, we begin with struggle, but we begin free." The weight of his words fell gently, like snow that seems light until it buries everything. "You would take me," she whispered, "with nothing." "No," he said, stepping closer, "with everything. With your spirit, your thoughts, your laugh, with the fire that's kept you from becoming what they've tried to shape you into." Her throat closed, her heart ached, and yet her feet would not move. Nathaniel watched her, the space between them thick with longing and fear. "You don't have to say yes," he murmured, "but you deserve the chance to say no to something that's never been yours." She closed her eyes. He waited, but she said nothing. At last he bowed his head. "I won't come again," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Whatever you choose, you owe me nothing." And with that, he turned and left. The doors closed behind him with barely a sound, and yet in her heart they slammed. That evening, the Van Allen house buzzed with activity. The pre-wedding banquet, hosted at the Chestnut Street residence of one of Whitfield's closest political allies, was to be the grandest gathering yet. Guests arrived in carriages drawn by liveried coachmen, their laughter rising before their feet even touched the steps. Strings played in the parlour, champagne was chilled in silver buckets. A tower of spun sugar teetered in the corner of the dining hall like a fragile dream. Penelope wore emerald silk. Her mother had insisted it brought out the strength in her eyes. A jewelled comb held back her hair. She walked like a woman who knew her place, and yet, with every step, her heart felt like glass, each moment threatening to crack it beyond repair. Whitfield was already on his third glass of brandy when she arrived. His cheeks bore the flush of indulgence, his voice a touch too loud, his laugh a bit too sharp. He welcomed guests with a confidence only money could embolden, placing his hand on Penelope's back with practiced ease. To the outside world, it was perfect. The banker, the bride, the bargain sealed. But inside, Penelope moved like a ghost wearing emerald. It was later in the evening, when most had moved toward the smoking room and the parlour buzzed with idle gossip, that she overheard it. Whitfield stood with a group of older men, judges, industrialists, men whose fortunes outpaced their decency. They were speaking of breeding, of families, of matches made not in heaven, but in ledgers. Whitfield swirled his glass. "You've no idea what a well-trained filly can be worth when you break her in properly," he said, chuckling. "It's not about affection, gentlemen, it's about discipline. The Van Allens come from good blood. What she lacks in fortune, she'll make up in silence." The men laughed. Penelope froze, her gloved hand still clutching her fan. The words sliced through the din, landing not in her ears, but in her soul. She didn't speak, didn't scream. She turned, walked away, not to the powder room, not to the hallway, but to the glass doors leading out onto the garden terrace, where winter roses bloomed in spite of the frost, and the moon hung low, disinterested in the cruelty of men. There in the cold, her breath visible in the air, she stood utterly still. The insult had not wounded her pride. It had murdered something far more precious, her last illusion. She had thought, perhaps foolishly, that there would be dignity in resignation, that endurance might be a quiet form of strength. But now she saw clearly this was not marriage. It was transaction. Her silence was currency, her obedience the prize. She pressed her hand to her chest as if trying to stop her own heart from fleeing. A servant came to find her minutes later, speaking her name softly. "Miss Van Allen, Mr. Whitfield is asking where you've gone." She turned slowly, the frost clinging to the edge of her gown. "Tell him," she said, her voice calm and sharp as cut glass, "that I was listening." Then she walked back into the house, not as a bride, not as a daughter, not as a possession, but as a woman no longer willing to be bought. The house was too quiet for a home meant to celebrate an impending wedding. No laughter echoed through the halls. No music spilled from the parlour. The scent of lilacs, carefully arranged in porcelain vases in every corner, had grown stale, as though even the blooms had lost faith in the union they were meant to bless. Penelope stood in her father's study, the heavy velvet curtains drawn, the fire low and sullen in the hearth. Outside, the afternoon light had faded into a dim amber haze, and the ticking of the mantel clock marked time with a rhythm that felt like judgment. Whitfield was there, seated in the chair opposite her, his hands resting on his cane, though he did not need it. He did many things he did not need to do. Control had always been his true crutch. She had summoned him, and now that he sat before her, entirely too composed, she felt the words gather like storm clouds in her throat. "I can't marry you," she said at last. No softness, no apology, only truth. Whitfield didn't flinch. He merely tilted his head, as though regarding an unpredictable horse. "You're upset," he said calmly. "That's understandable. But the arrangements have been made, Penelope. The guests are arriving next week. The invitations—" "This isn't about invitations," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "It's about me, and I will not be yours." He rose slowly, not in anger, but in deliberate menace. "You would do this," he said, "after all I've done for your family, after what your name has cost me." "My name is not for sale," she replied, her spine stiffening. He approached, stopping mere inches from her. "You think society will applaud this little rebellion? That they'll carry you on their shoulders and write poems in your honor? You will be ruined, Penelope. Not gently, not in whispers, but entirely. I will see to it." "You already ruined me," she said, her voice low. "With your words. With your arrogance. I won't wear the name of a man who calls me a transaction." His eyes narrowed. "Then I will sue you," he hissed, "for breach of promise. I'll drag your name through every court in the city. And your father, What do you think will happen to him when the banks withdraw their loans, when your family's debt is exposed like rot beneath silk? I will not be your bride, she said again, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with finality, no matter the cost. He stared at her for a long moment, and then, with a cold, humorless smile, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor like a verdict. The moment the door closed, Penelope sank into the chair, her breath shallow, her limbs too weak to hold the weight of what she had just done. She did not cry. She waited. It didn't take long. Within the hour, her mother stormed into the room, letter in hand, face pale with fury. "What have you done, Mrs.?" Van Allen's voice cracked like porcelain. Penelope rose, slowly. "I told the truth." "The truth?" Her mother's voice rose to a shriek. "You have condemned us. Do you understand? Condemned us to poverty, to humiliation, to ruin." Penelope said nothing. She could not. Her mother's sobs shattered the silence. "We gave you everything," she wailed. "Dresses, tutors, a name. You were to restore this family. You were our hope." "I was your pawn," Penelope said quietly. "Mrs." Van Allen staggered back as if struck. Her hand clutched the edge of the writing desk for support. Then, slowly, she sank to the floor, crumpling in her skirts like a broken doll. The servants came quickly. The maid screamed. Mr. Van Allen appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his silence more damning than words. Penelope watched as they lifted her mother from the floor, still sobbing, her cries echoing through the halls, and yet she did not move. She remained rooted in place, staring at the spot where her future had fractured. Night fell with the weight of lead. Her room was silent, untouched by the commotion below. The candles burned low, their flames flickering as if uncertain whether to persist. The wedding gown hung from the armoire door, a masterpiece of satin and lace. It shimmered in the low light, the pearl buttons like eyes watching her. She approached it slowly. Her hands moved without tremor. She removed the dress from its hanger, laid it across the floor, and stood over it for a long moment. Then, one by one, she lit the candles again. Each flame she carried to the hearth with quiet reverence. The fabric caught slowly at first, then bloomed into fire, an elegant devouring blossom. The lace curled, the silk blackened. The scent of burning luxury filled the air, heavy and sweet. Penelope watched as it turned to ash, the gown that had been chosen for a life not her own. A symbol of everything that had been taken, demanded, expected. She did not cry. When only embers remained, she sat at her writing desk and composed a single note. It said nothing of defiance, only that she would not stay. She did not sign it. Before dawn, she dressed in her simplest traveling dress, tied her bonnet with care, and gathered a single valise. Nora, the young maid, stood in the corridor. She said nothing, only watched as Penelope descended the stairs, her face pale with wonder and sorrow. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Penelope paused at the threshold. "Where they don't know my name," she said, "and don't ask for my silence." Then she opened the door and stepped into the cold. The carriage waited at the corner, dark and discreet. The driver tipped his hat without question. Penelope climbed in without a chaperone, without a companion, without permission. The wheels rolled forward, slow and steady, into a city that still slept. By morning, word would spread. The Van Allen girl had vanished, and no one knew where to find her. The wind that blew across the low hills outside the city carried no judgment. It stirred the bare trees gently, ran its fingers through the brittle grass, and whispered over the fields like a hymn. Far from the gaslight and carriages of Philadelphia, time moved differently here, slower, kinder. The small Quaker household that had taken Penelope in sat at the end of a narrow lane, sheltered by tall oaks and surrounded by frost-bitten gardens, still asleep beneath the late winter sky. The house was whitewashed and plain, its windows dressed with muslin, its silence deep but never oppressive. It was a place built on simplicity, reverence, and quiet mercy. Penelope had arrived with only one valise and no name on her lips. The Quaker matron, Mrs. Ellis, had not asked for explanations. She had offered warm tea, a room with a narrow bed, and a basin of water. That night, Penelope had cried for the first time in weeks, not out of grief, but out of release. She woke each morning to the sound of distant birds, to the rustle of aprons and soft footfalls in the corridor. She helped prepare meals, folded linens, swept floors. She read by lamplight and walked the orchard paths at dusk, her thoughts still but never empty. For the first time in her life, she had no one to please, no mask to wear, no obligation but to breathe and exist. And yet his face never left her. Nathaniel. She carried him in her memory like a candle she dared not light, for fear it would burn too brightly. But he came. He arrived on a quiet afternoon, as the sun was beginning to lean westward, its light slanting across the windows. Penelope had just finished folding a stack of woolen blankets and was placing them in a cedar chest in the sitting room when she heard the knock. It was not hesitant. It was not forceful. It was measured, steady, as he was. She opened the door. He stood on the threshold, his hat in hand, the wind gently lifting the edges of his coat. He had not shaved, and the journey had left dust on his boots, but his eyes, those eyes, were the same. Hazel, steady, searching. For a long breath, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "I heard you disappeared." "I did," she replied. "I looked for you anyway." She stepped aside. He crossed the threshold with the care of someone entering sacred ground. Inside, the warmth of the fire touched his face, and for a moment he looked as though he didn't believe she was real. "How did you find me?" she asked softly. "I didn't," he said. "Nora found me." Penelope blinked. "She sent a note," he continued. "Said you were safe, that you were here, that if I had any sense at all, I'd go to you before someone else did." A silence bloomed. She pressed her hands together, unsure of what to say. "I was going to leave," he added. "Truly, I thought maybe that you had made your choice." "I did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I chose not to be owned." His chest lifted with a slow, quiet breath. They sat in the small parlor, 2 cups of tea cooling between them, but neither reaching for them. Penelope's hands rested in her lap, fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. Nathaniel watched her with the expression of a man who knew he was standing on the edge of something fragile. "I thought of you," she said at last, "every day. But I had to disappear, not just from them, but from the version of myself they made me carry." "And what did you find instead?" he asked. She turned her head toward the window. The branches outside danced gently against the sky. "I found peace. Not the kind you're given, but the kind you take back. I never knew what it was to sit still and not be afraid of who I was when no one was watching." He looked at her. "And now," she met his gaze, "now I'm not running. I'm choosing." The words landed between them with the weight of truth. Nathaniel's voice was low. "And what do you choose?" "You," she said. "Not because you saved me, not because you offered me an escape, but because when you looked at me, you saw someone worth choosing. Even before I did." His eyes shone with something he didn't name. Then slowly he reached for her hand. She gave it without hesitation. The warmth of his skin met hers like the quiet rising of dawn. "I can't promise you ease," he said, "or comfort, or a life without struggle. I'm not asking for that," she whispered. "I only want the right to belong to myself, and to someone who sees me as more than a possession." He nodded. "Then marry me. Not in a ballroom, not in silk, but in truth." She smiled, tears blurring her vision. "Yes." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, words no longer necessary, but the world was not far behind. 3 days later, as Nathaniel returned from the post office in town, having sent notice to the Veterans Hospital that he would not return just yet, he found a man waiting by the lane. Dressed in a grey coat with fine stitching and gloves too delicate for farm roads, The man introduced himself as a representative of Mr. Whitfield's legal counsel. Nathaniel stood tall, unflinching. "You are hereby informed," the man said smoothly, "that Mr. Horace Whitfield intends to pursue legal action against Miss Penelope Van Allen for breach of promise. Damages will include slander, public embarrassment, and significant financial injury." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "And should she refuse to return to Philadelphia, further consequences will follow." Without a word, Nathaniel took the sealed envelope the man offered. He did not read it until he returned to the house. Penelope was in the garden, kneeling near the edge of the stone path, her fingers dusted with soil as she tended a bed of stubborn tulips that had begun to rise against the frost. When she looked up and saw the envelope in his hand, she stilled. He handed it to her silently. She opened it with care. Her eyes moved slowly over the page. Then she folded it, tucked it back into the envelope, and laid it gently on the table beside her. "Well," she said, her voice calm, "it seems the price of freedom has arrived." Nathaniel knelt before her. "You don't have to face this alone." She looked at him, her eyes clear. "I never planned to." He took her hand, kissed her knuckles with reverence. And as the sun dipped behind the bare trees, Penelope Van Allen chose, once again, not silence, not obedience, not fear. She chose to face the world, but this time with her hand in his. Spring had returned to Philadelphia with a gentle defiance, as though the city itself had grown weary of cold silences and heavy skies. Magnolia trees bloomed on Walnut Street, their pale pink petals trembling on branches like secrets ready to fall. Gaslights flickered longer now, and carriage wheels splashed through soft puddles formed by melting snow. The world, at last, was waking, and so was she. Inside the Grand Union League Club, preparations for the annual spring gala were well underway. The chandeliers had been polished to a blinding gleam, tables dressed in imported linens, and a quartet tuned their instruments beneath a painted ceiling. Guests arrived in layers of lace and silks, in brocade waistcoats and gleaming cufflinks. The scent of rosewater mingled with tobacco, and the room was filled with the unmistakable hum of wealth, expectation, and spectacle. Horace Whitfield entered precisely at 8. He wore a black tailcoat trimmed in satin, a white waistcoat with pearl buttons, and a smile that had grown sharper in recent weeks. Rumors had swirled about his jilted engagement. Some whispered that the Van Allen girl had eloped with a coachman, others that she had fled to Europe in disgrace. Whitfield, for his part, had said little, but tonight his posture spoke for him. He walked with the stride of a man who believed himself restored. He paused briefly in the middle of the ballroom, letting his eyes scan the glittering crowd. The room hushed in a subtle ripple as people noted his arrival. Conversation shifted, fans fluttered. He greeted old allies with nods, new ones with calculated charm. He raised a glass of champagne and toasted no one in particular. The murmurs resumed around him, just as planned. And then the room changed, not suddenly, not loudly, but like the scent of rain before the downpour, something shifted. At the far end of the ballroom, where the double doors opened onto the main hall, a figure appeared, Penelope Van Allen, on Nathaniel Prescott's arm. She wore no tiara, no jewels, no brooch passed down from proud mothers. Her gown was soft grey, simple in its cut, with sleeves that fell in gentle lines to her wrists and a high collar trimmed in pearl stitching. Her hair was swept into a low knot, unadorned save for a single ivory comb. She did not smile. She did not need to. The hush fell like snow. Whitfield turned slowly, his glass frozen in mid-air. Their eyes met. For the briefest instant, he seemed to forget himself. His expression faltered, not with shock but with something closer to disbelief. Penelope's presence in this room, at this hour, in that gown, was not a rebellion. It was a reckoning. She walked forward, Nathaniel beside her, his presence firm but quiet. He did not look around. He looked only at her. They stopped near the center of the ballroom, just beneath the chandelier, where Whitfield had once raised a toast to his future wife. Penelope turned. She faced them all. No music played. No voice interrupted. She did not raise her hands. She raised only her voice. "I stand here," she began, "not to correct a rumor or reclaim a title. I stand because silence has cost too many women their names, their worth, and their freedom." A sharp breath ran through the room. She continued, "There are men in this room who believe they can buy legacy, love, or dignity with gold, who believe that a woman's silence is a form of gratitude. I was promised to one such man, and when I dared to walk away, he threatened not only me but my family, through reputation, through debt, through shame." A tremble moved through the gathering. Whitfield's jaw tightened. He stepped forward. "Miss Van Allen," she turned to him. "Mr. Whitfield," she said calmly, "you have used your influence to intimidate, to silence, and to control, but I owe you nothing, not my hand, not my silence, and not my fear." He opened his mouth again, but no words came. Penelope turned back to the crowd. "I will not apologize for choosing dignity over wealth. I will not ask your approval for loving a man who speaks to me with honesty rather than ambition. And I will not stand beneath this chandelier under the weight of tradition and deception, pretending that civility is more valuable than truth." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, from the corner of the room, an older woman, a widow known for her quiet grace, set down her glass and nodded once. Another woman followed, then a man, not many, but enough. A ripple of subtle approval moved through the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Whitfield, red-faced and stiff, turned on his heel and walked out of the ballroom. The doors closed behind him with a muted thud. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was reverent. Penelope did not linger. She turned to Nathaniel, who offered her his arm once more, and together they walked out of the Union League Club, not with fanfare, but with freedom. In the weeks that followed, whispers continued, but they no longer spoke of scandal. They spoke of her strength, of the night she stood in the lion's den and refused to be devoured. Whitfield's reputation eroded in small, humiliating ways. Invitations were rescinded. Supporters withdrew. Lawsuits faded quietly into the background. No one wanted to be the last man defending a fallen titan. Penelope and Nathaniel were married in a quiet chapel nestled beside the Veterans Hospital. There were no carriages lined along the street, no society pages reporting on the flowers or the menu. The guests were men with missing limbs and women with lined faces, hands held over hearts as the vows were spoken. Penelope wore a soft cream gown with no corset. Nathaniel wore his father's watch chain. They exchanged no rings of gold, only vows woven from truth. Afterward they walked hand in hand through Rittenhouse Square, now dotted with crocuses and daffodils. The breeze carried the scent of soil and sunlight. They did not speak. They did not need to. She no longer wore the name of a family that had tried to cage her. He no longer stood on the edges of a world that once dismissed him. They had carved a place between two classes, two silences, two worlds, and in that place they began again, not as fugitives, but as builders of something unspoken, and finally, truly theirs. 7 years had passed. Spring returned to Philadelphia with the same soft insistence as before, brushing color over cobblestones and coaxing blossoms from dogwood branches. But something in the city had changed. A new generation of women walked with firmer steps and straighter spines. Their gloves were still buttoned, their hats still pinned, but their eyes no longer tilted down when spoken to. And though not everyone named Penelope Van Allen, many had learned to live as if they could be her. At the edge of Fairmount Park, in a modest but sun-filled house with ivy climbing its brick walls, the laughter of children danced on the breeze. Inside, the scent of warm bread mingled with the creak of polished wood floors and the sound of pages turning. Nathaniel Prescott sat on the porch, a book forgotten in his lap, as he watched his daughter chase her younger brother through the grass. The boy, barely 4, was all knees and elbows, his curls wild in the wind. The girl, nearly 6, ran with a determined grace that mirrored her mother's. Her name was Eleanor, though Nathaniel often called her his tiny storm. He smiled without realizing it. From inside, a voice floated out. "They'll trip on that root again if you don't stop them." Penelope stepped onto the porch, drying her hands with a linen towel. Her hair was looser now, streaked gently with sun and the passage of time. She wore a faded blue dress with a wide sash, a simple locket around her neck, and an ease in her expression that 7 years ago would have seemed impossible. "They need to fall sometimes," Nathaniel said, reaching for her hand. "It teaches them where not to land." Penelope sat beside him. "That's something you would say." He kissed her knuckles. "That's something you taught me." They sat in silence, watching the children tumble in the grass. Behind them, a table inside the house held unopened letters and old invitations, one from the city's university inviting Penelope to speak at a women's symposium, another from the hospital asking Nathaniel to return as an advisor. They chose which ones to answer, no longer out of fear, but out of freedom. Whitfield had not recovered. After the scandal, he lost his place on several boards. A quiet investigation into his banking practices led to a swift and brutal fall from grace. He had relocated to New York, where he lived in a penthouse he rarely left, his name now associated more with caution than prestige. Penelope had not spoken of him since the day she wed. Her parents had moved to a smaller house outside the city. Their fortune, what remained of it, was managed by Nora, who had since opened a small lending bureau that offered credit to widows and unmarried women starting shops and bakeries. She said it was less about profit, more about survival. The world had not changed overnight, but it had shifted, and that was enough. As the sun dipped low, Eleanor climbed the steps and settled between her parents, breathless and glowing. Her brother followed, arms full of yellow tulips he had clumsily picked. "Are you tired yet?" Penelope asked. Eleanor shook her head fiercely. "Not even close." Penelope laughed. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "Someone?" She wore silk and bitterness like armor, until she traded both for something much harder to wear. "What was that?" Eleanor asked. "Hope," Penelope said. Nathaniel's hand found hers again. The breeze carried the sound of bells from the city centre. Evening was coming, and with it, the quiet certainty that the life they had built on ashes, on choice, on defiance, had not only endured, but bloomed. Love, Penelope had once feared, was a delicate thing, but she had learned. The truest love was not fragile. It grew through winters. It reached for light, and it never forgot how to begin again. In a world that often demanded obedience over desire, appearances over truth, and wealth over the soul, Penelope and Nathaniel chose something far more rare. They chose each other. Not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because it was right. This story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet act of walking away from everything you've ever known to follow the call of your own heart. Penelope's journey is a mirror to many of us. Maybe you too have felt the weight of duty, the silence of fear, or the sting of being misunderstood. But know this, it is never too late to reclaim your voice, to choose love over fear, dignity over comfort, truth over acceptance. If you felt something in your chest while listening to this story, if Penelope's bravery stirred your soul, or Nathaniel's quiet strength brought a tear to your eye, then you are part of this journey too. Leave us a comment with the word bloom so we know you walked every step of this path with us. That single word will help us find each other. Those who still believe in love that fights, endures, and blossoms. And if this story touched you, please don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, a sister, a daughter, a mother, someone who needs to remember that love, real love, always finds a way. We've left more powerful love stories for you in the cards above. Go explore them, because somewhere another Penelope is waiting to be heard. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. And remember, love does not ask for permission. It simply blooms.